oh, I know that street. So authenticity, but distances for me is like the way and the geography and the terrain. Like I'm working on a new book right now, and it takes place over a span of a week or two, and there's a foot journey through kind of from New Mexico to Denver to Colorado, and so I've spent a lot of hours tracing like train tracks through the mountains and finding tunnels and things that actually, when you find those things in the real world, maybe they jar something loose in the plot or in the narrative that you hadn't thought of that could be a setting for something. But to the question of whether you go there, if I'm not familiar with a place, I like to go there if I can, if it's possible. But because I think I had an experience with my first book where my wife and I took a trip out west, and we came back through Texas, and that book's set in West Texas, and so I said, well, hey, let's drive through this part of Texas, and we did it a certain time of day, and like the light hits the desert in a certain way at time of day, and that wasn't in my book, and I didn't know that because I'd never been in the desert at that certain time of day, and I immediately went home and put it in the book, and so it's just things like that, details really.
I guess it's the idea of when you watch a movie that is like takes place in New York, but it's filmed in Toronto, and you like if you haven't been there, you'll be like, wait a minute, this feels different than the kind of environment that it's supposed to take place.
It does make me think too of people, because your settings obviously have to have people and stuff, and they're from the area. And we know that in different regions there are certain customs and thoughts and stuff, such as if you've never been to the desert, you may not have thought of what you just thought of in a sense. And this is especially true in southern fiction, I know, where there's a lot of diehard customs down here that aren't shared elsewhere. And when people try to write about the South, sometimes they really don't get it right. And so what sort of things do you think of when you're building your worlds, in a sense, ahead of time about capturing people, and this is especially for secondary worlds? How do you think up new customs that are unique to particular areas of your world that you build?
Well, to some extent, you may not want to take my approach to world building, because I build worlds in the Carl Sagan method, who once said to make an apple pie from scratch, you must first invent the universe. Just first make the universe. So I mean, I start with the size and composition of the star, and the size. I really do the size, and the length of a calendar year. How long does the planet take? What's the atmosphere like? Where are the tectonic plates? I wish I was joking. I'm not joking. And then I get more and more granular with the details, and until I start getting into, well, what's the climate like in this area, and what would they likely have in abundance, and what would they need? And then you start getting into societies and the various different customs and cultures that ultimately are going to serve your story. Most authors I know who write second world fiction do it the opposite way. They figure out the characters they want, they figure out the plot that they want, and they create the second world to support those, and that is a valid way to do things, absolutely. It's just not how I approach it, because I really like building my constraints first. And this is part of what lets me do that. And the other thing that this lets me do is create a world that ultimately is, particularly when you write fantasy, there is a trap, a potential trap, that you are going to write what you know. And what most of us know looks an awful lot like Camelot. It looks an awful lot like Europe, and it's filled with white people. And I don't really want that. So by starting it from someplace else, that gives me an opportunity to say, well, okay, so this is a country that is very closely tied to the maritime trade, and therefore they're going to have a lot of customs that are based on sea travel, or, you know, in the book that I have coming out, these are people who live on mountaintops, and everything about them has to do with living at high altitude. And that trickles down into everything at that point. So I start with the things that sneak in. So much in our language sneaks in that we don't realize. You know, phrases and ways, turns of speech that we have to kind of watch out for. But figuring those things out for society says so much about what that society values.
I don't necessarily have an answer for my own writing, but I will answer for my reading, which is when I read The Hollow Kind by Andy, it felt like I was entering into a world that I just never knew existed. It felt like a place, you know, it's historical, it's not, it kind of toggles between present and past. And it felt so researched and so meticulous in its detailing. You know, I've never asked Andy this question, but the idea of like, how did you create this world? How did you research this world? How did you find this world? How did you know, crack this world open? And it felt lived in to the extent that I would believe that Andy had been there. So that's my answer.
I actually have a follow-up question for you, Jenn. How long does it take to do that? Like when you build a world, how long does it take before you start writing the process of the narrative?
Right. Well, for A Chorus of Dragons, it took about 30 years.
Do you stay in that one world?
No.
Yeah.
No. For The Sky on Fire, it took about 2 months. So, but of course, A Chorus of Dragons has a lot more in-depth world building to it than The Sky on Fire does. You know, I mean, the reason why most people will recommend that you not start with the world building is because the world building doesn't have to ever end. It doesn't have to stop. You can spend 30 years doing the world building and still have plenty of things that you have not figured out. Yeah, hi Tolkien. But the reverse is also true. You know, if you start with the characters and the plot and that side of things, there are parts of that society that you may never touch. So it really depends, but it's not a super fast process, I will admit. Usually the process of, fortunately there are programs that exist. There's a program called G-Plates that's I believe free, and it is really useful because you can use it to put your map on a globe and see what it'll actually look like on a globe, which usually will send you back to the drawing board to redo your north and south poles because you've probably not done them correctly when they're wrapped around. And then there's another program called Climasim, which I believe was actually created by somebody here in Atlanta who teaches meteorology. And that's a great program because you can use it to put your map into it and tell it how high or how low everything is and put the features of your world in, and it'll tell you what the temperatures would be like for seasonal variations. And from that you can figure out what the weather is going to be like, what the meteorology is going to be like. That process, though, of figuring that all out usually takes me about 2 weeks.
So as you're thinking of a wider world and stuff, this brings us more to the business side of writing, which is that so much of it these days seems to be about franchises and larger universes, whether it's the Marvel universe, which I know Clay has contributed to, or Star Wars, et cetera, the ability to take your world, which you may have just started with a story and characters, but it grows and grows, and there are all sorts of other stories you might want to tell in that, or let other people tell stories in it. And is this something that you think about when you're writing? And if so, what sort of tricks do you think you could hand on to other writers? And if not, why not? Because it seems to me Hollywood, everybody else is beating down the doors for these sorts of properties.
Well, I've been fortunate to write for Marvel Comics, and it's wonderful because it's their sandbox, and they allow you to play with their toys, and it's always, all of the action figures are there. So there's Spider-Man, there's the X-Men, there's Thor, and you get to kind of say, like, can I play with that one? Or they'll say, hey, do you want to play with this one? And then you kind of write to that character within that storyline or that kind of canon. And I mean, Marvel is very particular. There are guidelines and rules and kind of, there's a more of a conversation with your team, which is actually, I find fun for me, because you get to kind of like drop in, tell your story within the confines of their guidelines, and then you get to kind of step away. But the kind of give and take conversation that you're having with your editor, they usually come to me and say, this is the character that we want you to write for. This is this is where we ended it last, and this is where you will end it. And then you have to fill in that space. And it's usually with a large, you have to kind of inherit the storyline, because no stories die with Marvel. Like everything, they just want to kind of continue and perpetuate, and a sin that was committed in issue 238 will come to roost in 739, and you have to be aware of that. And that's what these amazing editors at Marvel tend to be. Like, they are encyclopedias for every issue that you've never read, and sometimes that's what the assistant editor is for, and if not the assistant editor, they have their whole archive to kind of like, oh God, what happened? What was he wearing?
And then I ask him.
But it's, I do think that, it is, the story is yours, but the kind of, the characters, the world, it's theirs. And, I always find that kind of liberating, because I'm not being tasked with world building as much as like, what's the boundary that I can push? What is the kind of untouched, uncharted territory, which is hard to find sometimes with Marvel, because they keep coming back to that well, but every so often it's there.
So no further stories in the Ghost Eaters verse, that sort of thing?
I mean, I would do it in a heartbeat, but no one's banging down the door yet.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, like, talking about writers building universes, right? Like, I think it was in Joe Hill's Nosferatu that I came across that aha moment in that text where you see the map of the whatever the fantasy otherscape is in that book. And I think there was a little blip on it that said something like Pennywise's Circus, and it was just like, oh gosh, that's amazing for so many reasons, but in my mind, there's always been a loose affiliation between books. So, like, if something happened in 1980 in my first book, and something happened in 1978 or 9 in my second book, well, the world in 1989 in my third book comes from those worlds. Those things happened in that world in the past. So, yeah, I mean, there's no grand plan with that, but, yeah.
Expanded. And Davidson universe.
I haven't yet had the pleasure of working on any IPs, but I have had the first book in my series, The Ruin of Kings, was optioned, and so I had some really interesting conversations with producers about what they wanted and what they were looking for, and they were looking, at the time, they were looking for what they would call a tentpole property, which is, you know, we're looking for something that we can turn into, you know, a Marvel Universe style of movie after movie and comic book and TV show and et cetera, et cetera. And I realized pretty quickly that they were not really interested in my book half as much as they were interested in the world building I'd done for my book. Because nobody in the writer's room has time. Nobody in the writer's room has time to do world building, which is why you see some of the things that you do that sometimes come across as a little bit problematic. So they would much rather, I mean, it's the part of the joy of having a really well done history to draw from, right? Is that you don't have to sit there and think about how a given thing works. So I would say that that is one of the advantages to doing an awful lot of world building, is that the world building itself is sellable, which was not a thing I understood when I got started.
All right, well, let me go to another aspect. This is mainly, again, for secondary worlds, but, you know, you have to deal with it to a certain degree with other ones, and that's names and languages and things like that. And especially fantasy worlds have all sorts of strange names. But even in this world, like I said, if you have to name a street and stuff, you want to make sure it fits right for that sort of thing. And any thoughts you can give writers on that sort of thing?
This is why I created 6 different languages for my first series. Because if I didn't, everybody sounded like they came from Europe. Again, we write what we know. And by the way, I'm gonna tangent for a brief second here, just to say that that this is a scary thought, but everything you are, what you do, all of you will show up in your writing. It's not meant to be scary, that's meant to be, this is the reason why you should be writing. Because no one else is going to be able to pull that into it. No matter, they could be writing the exact same story, it doesn't matter. Who you are comes out in your work. Sorry, back to the languages thing. So vulgar.org, I believe, is the web address. There's a lovely gentleman who has created a shockingly sophisticated conlang generation program. It is not, I don't think, free, or at least a lot of the cooler features are not given if you use the free version. But it is it's a starting place, potentially, if you do not have a degree in linguistics.
Conlang is construction.
Yeah, sorry, yeah, conlang stands for constructed language. And, you know, we encounter them a lot. You know, the amount of work that's been done. I know the guy who wrote a significant chunk of Klingon. And, you know, it is a fully realized language at this point. You know, entire books have been written in Klingon, which is wild. But I primarily create languages to name stuff. That's almost the entirety of why I do it, is because I want the names to not sound like something that you can look at and go, oh, well, that's Japanese. You know, sometimes they end up sounding like my current book. An awful lot of the names ended up sounding Welsh. I promise the language they are based off of, not Welsh, but you know, it's what happened. I went with it. So that's my personal thing, is I will create a new language so that I can use it to construct names. Most of those names, if I were to break them down, you would laugh at me because the meaning of them is often hilariously on the nose. I have one person's name, I believe, that, and I'm not going to ever say who translates as good boy. But if you translate a lot of, if you go into the etymology of a lot of our names, that's not actually as uncommon as we might think. Somebody's name is just translated as, you know, good daughter.
Well, let me move on into horror a bit here, which is when you're building a horror story, I guess the question is, because it's got to be believable in a certain way at first, at least if you're in this world, and how can you bring in scary stuff without it seeming silly? Because in our world, a lot of weird, scary things like sightings of Bigfoots or UFOs or whatever can seem awful silly in this stuff. So do you ever have to worry about, does this seem silly, or is this the right kind of scary, or maybe it is the kind of weird childlike kind of thing that then turns out to be something way more horrible than you imagine? I know that's a rather broad question.
I would say the real world has so many elements in it that are frightening, not in terms of what people do, but just in terms of the way light falls in a room or doesn't fall, the way things sound in nature. And so I think for horror, atmosphere is a great deal of what creates horror. The sense of dread is what I try to capture, and that comes so much from environment and place, which you can pay me later for this. In What Kind of Mother, Clay does this fantastic job with atmosphere, with the Chesapeake Bay area and salt marshes and like tasting it, smelling it, but there's one scene, it's sort of part of the scene you read from on Thursday at Eagle Eye. There's a scene where a character goes for a night swim, and what's so effective about that scene is the sense of enveloping darkness. And so it's not what we see in the world, but what we don't see. And then suddenly the entire world becomes connected to us as readers through the character's sensation of something slithering over her shoulder at night, or something she thinks like moves in the water near her. And so I would say, like, for me, horror and atmosphere and environment and setting are all connected through the character's experience of those things. So in the real world, I think there's plenty of fodder without introducing silly elements, you know, that definitely can go off that way. Yeah.
Thank you. It's interesting that you said the word silly, and I was like, oh wow. And I've been on book tour, and I went to Frederick, Maryland. And in Frederick, Maryland, there was an ice cream store, and I was at this ice cream store, and I was like, oh, this is the local ice cream shop. I'm gonna get some ice cream. And they had a flavor called the Snallygaster. And I was like, what's the Snallygaster? I'll have that. And they're like, oh, do you know about the Snallygaster? And I was like, no, tell me about the Snallygaster. And they're like, well, there just so happens to be in Frederick, Maryland, the Snallygaster, which is our own cryptid, and it is a creature that is like half lizard, half chicken, half, you know, where they kind of created this hybrid, and I was like, oh my god. The flavor was peanut butter and chocolate, and it was lovely, but they like went on this whole kind of like story of like what the Snallygaster is, and it was like eating a squid, and like you're just like, they're telling this story, and I'm just like, this is the most like absurd thing I've ever heard. And they're like, no, but it's real, and like, you know, and so I was like, okay, sure. And but like this local ice cream store was selling like Snallygaster stuffies, and like, you know, there were like, and all of a sudden I'm like walking through Frederick, Maryland, and I see T-shirts for the Snallygaster. I'm like, what is this thing? And you know, I go home and I do the Google, and like all of a sudden it's like, oh my God, the Snallygaster is I mean, it is apparently a thing, but like the dark, like you kind of like follow the story, the urban legend, the myth, all the way to its core, and it like the layer of it gets to something far more deeper and far more darker of like this story. Like at some point the story is there in order to kind of keep children from kind of like straying too far in the fields, but then it's like it goes even further, and it's like, wait a minute, this is a story that was created to kind of like, you know, terrify like slaves to like, in order to like keep them from, you know, running, you know, like escaping from the plantation, and it was just like, oh my God. And like to go from the point of origin to a flavor of ice cream, and mapping that, like tracking that course, it's kind of the reverse of what you're talking about with horror. And you know, there's no grander point but to kind of say that like these stories have an elasticity. They might, you know, a photocopy of their origins, but like if you can kind of map that trajectory, it's kind of profound and truly unnerving.
I mean, I do not have the experience of these fine gentlemen. I'm just going to say that I think that whether or not it is silly or it is horrifying or dreadful, in my opinion, is approach. Because the same thing can be both. It's purely how the writer chooses to approach the subject. The words you choose are going to decide if that is something someone laughs at or someone stays up late at night about.
Yeah, it's the feeling of fantastical, supernatural, or not. You're creating a world that either, you know, secondary or real, you know, whatever, however you want to kind of say it. You're grounding us in the reader in a world that feels inhabited, that feels real. So it doesn't matter if it's on Mars or on Earth. You've created a place that exists and feels real enough to, you know, for these characters to kind of exist in that, so that when something supernatural or something beyond the kind of realm of our own personal experience, that still feels like it exists within that world of the book. So, I feel like, you know, as soon as the ghost comes in, or as soon as the vampire comes in, that is just as natural and organic and real of an extension of that world that you've created. That it's not, you know, it's like, oh, that's not real. You're not real. Like, it is real because this is our world.
Let me bring back another topic with the characters, and that's an individual protagonist versus an ensemble cast. Because I think ensemble casts are a way you can reveal aspects of your world, different cultures per se, through your cast that, you know, are a little more limited if you're just working with a single protagonist. But then again, you know, single protagonist can give you a very vibrant look at a particular aspect of that world. And do you have any thoughts on approaching that for writing books? Have you worked with ensemble casts, or are you mainly protagonists?
I'll just, so my third book had an ensemble cast, and it moved back and forth between different time periods on a single plot of land in Georgia. And I think it's interesting how characters give you different perspectives on a single place. So you've got your present day protagonist in the book who's bringing her son to this place as a refuge that turns out to be a hostile place, these woods. You've got a character in the past who looked at these woods and saw potential, saw money, saw a dynasty he could establish, and failed quite terribly. And then you've got other characters in the present day who are sort of the villains of the piece that look upon it with greed or envy, but somehow the land is like a mirror that casts back who the characters are in the way they perceive it, you know? So that's, yeah. And then there's individual characters, and just like, I think like, for me, I really like putting the reader in the experience of a single character to introduce the place, because how I want the reader to perceive the place may initially be a kind of kinship with that first character or that single protagonist.
I tend to write first-person narrative and kind of root within the kind of, you know, point of view of your protagonist. My next book for next year it's a third-person kind of tapestry of you know, a family and a kind of an extended family, and it's amazing how, you know, there's a certain kind of guardrail that's been taken off, but there's also a kind of like I'm lost in it. Like I miss my guardrails. But it is nice to get kind of in the head space of multiple characters. And I, you know, growing up, I loved books like Winesburg, Ohio, or Spoon River Anthology, or even like Rashomon, where you're given, you know, an opportunity to kind of look at a specific event, but through the eyes or the perspectives of multiple characters. And they're all, I mean, as I lay dying, like you're kind of being told one story, but through the kind of prism of all of these various characters. And I think that, like, what's always interesting and exciting about that is when there's a cognitive dissonance or like a narrative conflict, because one person sees it from one angle, and that is directly opposing to another character who sees it from a different angle. And you, the reader, are then left to say, well, who's telling the story right? And, you know, that's the wonderful nature of storytelling, where there's no right way of telling it. It's the kind of subjectivity of perspective that allows you to kind of see these things from how they filter it through.
So my books have a lot of characters. You know, the perennial cast of thousands, as it were. And there's a lot of different POVs. And as I'm sure George R. Martin can tell you as well, there is a risk to doing it this way. And I mean, there's a risk to doing it with one POV as well. And the risk is, if they don't like your POV person, if they don't like that voice, that point of view, you're done. They're going to put down your book. However, with an ensemble group, you run the same risks. You know, you run the risks that, you know, I'm sorry, I've gone 300 pages without seeing something about Arya, and that is enough for me. I don't like these people. Not, you know, naming names or anything. But it is a very rewarding opportunity to indeed show aspects of your culture, to show conflicting opinions, to highlight that, yes, the narration is unreliable. You know, most narration is unreliable, but readers put an astonishing amount of trust in you. And you know, it's just, I think it's fun to do it that way. But you do run the risk of, you know, my series always had 4 main characters. And the first book primarily focused on one of them, and the second book primarily focused on a different one. And I got letters. Oh my God, I got letters. Because they wanted that first one back. And he was there the whole time, but I was concentrating on someone else and they did not like it. Most people were fine with it. It was only a very few people. So yeah, there's a risk to it. As writers, it's a tool. So my recommendation is, whatever it is you do, just do it with intention, understanding that there will be benefits and there will be drawbacks to any approach you take. Pick the one that serves your purposes best.
All right, well, we're running a little short here, so let's do some Q&A before we leave. Your first one there, and whoever's going to want to answer that, can you repeat the question into the mics?
I'll stand to try to project. I don't want to be too loud. So would you approach reframing a real world tragedy in a skewed world?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear this in a what world?
A skewed world.
In a skewed world, okay. Do you mean like AUs, alternate realities?
Yes.
Okay, then I think you too.
So how do you take real world tragedy and kind of portray it in a skewed world? Skewed world's a toughie, but I mean, I feel like our world's pretty skewed. And it's interesting because I have written about real world tragedies in the past, and I feel like what I try to do is create a character. If it's writing about a specific tragedy, I get a little nervous because then there's a kind of like notion of being correct, or what is the level of authenticity of the details, because it's something that either that people have themselves experienced or are knowledgeable about. So I try to create a version of that tragedy that is parallel to the historical event, so that it allows me a certain ability to kind of take creative liberties that don't feel inappropriate or kind of improper. But it ultimately boils down to the characters who are experiencing those tragedies and making sure that their kind of emotional truth is grounded and I'm going to say real, but that's that it feels honest. And that is something that comes with research and being just very honest to the emotional impact of the moment. The details you can kind of either create or run parallel to that historical event. I guess my question to you is, like, are you wanting to be very specific to the event? Like, is it, do you want to write about 9/11, or is it like that you're creating a 9/12, a 9/21? It's that difference of, is the event itself real versus the world that you're creating unreal, and that event that happens is in that unreal world, if that makes any sense.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Oh, we got one back there. Striped. You. Yep.
Hey.
As long as we can hear it, we'll repeat it.
This is any of you can answer, but I was directing this at Andy. I've read most of your books and followed your career a lot in terms of like Southern Gothic and what you're doing with that, like a modern version of Southern Gothic, in my opinion. I was curious about your last book. Like, you have this family that's has a legacy, but you have this landscape that also has a legacy. And I wondered if you started with the setting and built the family from that, or if you started with the family and built the landscape from them.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yes. Okay. So she's asking, in my third book, I have a family, and I have with a legacy, and I have a landscape that impacts that family. Did I start with the family? Did I start with the landscape? I started with the landscape.
Okay.
Because in a way, like, this points back to our previous question too about real world tragedies versus skewed or in skewed worlds. And my book was rooted in a very specific event that historically happened in South Georgia. These land wars that were kind of a post-Civil War northern industrialists coming down and taking poor people's land and turning it into lumber mills and turpentine farms and things like that. So I started with that and built the idea of my characters in the past, at least, around that, and built that history up to kind of be emblematic of the real world that was the basis, but also branched it off in a direction that suited my ends, you know, as a horror writer. So yeah,
Yeah.
Landscape first.
Can I ask one more question about that? Like, I felt like that book specifically has sort of an environmental aspect about, you know, more like talking about the, you know, the impact of how turpentine farms and all that. And I don't know if like that was your intent or it just happened naturally. Does anyone ask you about that before?
I not specifically. I've written about it. Yeah. The question is, was there an intention there with that subject matter with turpentine farms to write about the environment? And I guess yes. I mean, like eco horror is a whole subgenre,
Yeah.
but I was not trying to write eco horror. You know, like I don't presume to be a Jeff Vandermeer who can write about something at that level of detail. I like characters and stories and emotions that are like stories that are rooted in emotion. So that was a part of it, but it was a part of it in the sense of like I went to museums and saw what was left of these forests in pictures, and I saw the trees themselves and what was done to them, and so it was more about my emotional response to that thing, and then and they're the lost characters in that story is the forest, because there's the people and the people that fought over the land, but then the trees just kind of get pushed to the background. So yes, but not to make a political statement, I guess would be the
And I
answer.
felt like, I did feel like that setting particularly was, the setting was a character in itself, you know, and you felt the emotions, like, just felt like succubus sort of situation going on.
So she made a comment about the place being a character in itself,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
you mentioned looking at pictures, so doing your research, that's a really good thing too. We have time for one more question. What's up? Oh, there you go.
So this is primarily for the horror writers or people who write in the modern. You talked about going to a place, or at least looking it up on Google Maps so that you got the details right. Given how fast businesses go out of business, places change, do you feel that that locks you into a specific time in exactly the same way that if you like said, oh, such and such movie just came out in the time frame that you're showing
The question is, you know, much like when you map out an area or researching a specific location and how with the kind of changing of time that like certain locations kind of disappear, and do you feel locked into that? I mean, yes, this is a sidebar, but like I'm writing something right now and Twitter was in it, and now Twitter is gone, and like, it's like there's like this feeling of like everything at a certain point becomes a historical novel, and it's just because that is the time it's written, and I feel as if, you know, if you're looking, I mean, yes, everything is of, it has to be of its kind of time frame or whatever that era is, and I feel like that kind of roots it to a place. I used to be like, never mention a pop culture reference, never mention a movie, never mention a TV show, because that just dates it. But then I read someone like Zadie Smith, who's like writing, you know, writes of the era and like writes of the time, and it just feels like it embraces it, and you want those kind of cultural touchstones, because it does root it to a specific, you know, time period and era and location, and I think that adds value. It enriches the world in a way. That world may no longer exist 5 months from now, but I think that's okay. It's when you say like, oh yeah, I went to that restaurant, and that restaurant hasn't been there for years, and someone says like, that place doesn't exist, and you're like, oh yeah, but nothing exists. We'll all be dead 5 years from now.
All right, with that, all good things must come to an end, but the world will live on.
That's a great way to end.
Yeah, I'm also kidding. We'll be dead soon.